Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Move Smartly channel. I'm the editor of Move Smartly here, Urmi Desai, and I'm with my colleague and co-host, John Pasalis, broker and president at Realosophy Realty. Hey, John.
Hello, everyone.
And it is time for our monthly feature, The Situation. This is a consumer Q&A where we take everybody's questions, and John takes his time to really respond to the real estate questions you have about the Toronto area market in a little bit more detail than he normally is able to. So again, once again, you can send us your questions at AskJohn@MoveSmartly or at any of our Twitter, YouTube, or other social media channels. So keep those questions coming.
Awesome.
How are you doing?
Very good, and looking forward to these. I love this segment. I love answering the questions, and thank you everyone for sending them in every month, and giving me a chance to talk about them and Urmi to discuss them. Obviously, because we get a lot of emails. And I think a lot of people get value just hearing about people's more specific situations that are a little bit tricky, or the questions are a little bit more challenging, and we need to unpack in a little bit more detail.
Great. And I should say we're welcoming both our YouTube viewers and our podcast listeners. We appreciate all of our viewers and listeners. So thank you for joining us. All right, let's get into our questions today, John. So number one. Hi, John. I have been sitting on the sidelines for some time. I'm interested in buying a home in Toronto, but I'm worried about the prices being unsustainably high and bubble-like, especially when you look at them relative to our income levels here and compare it to other markets in the world. Prices seem really irrational. I'm worried that if I buy now, prices will crash as they are forced to become more rational. What are your views on this situation? Thanks, Manu.
Oh man, this is a big question.
This is the $1 million question.
It is, and I get this quite a bit, of course. A lot of people have a lot of anxiety about high home prices. On the one hand, obviously, there's this anxiety about if I don't jump in, am I going to kind of miss the boat? And prices just seem like they keep going higher. And then obviously on the flip side, like this question is, are they going to crash down to levels that seem more rational to us? So this one's a tricky. So, I mean, maybe we're going to spend a little bit of time to unpack this one, because I think it's a challenging one. And I think we need to kind of talk about and unpack some of the ideas and the assumptions behind it about what is sustainable, what is affordable, what is a bubble.
And what is rational. It would be good to understand those terms too.
Yeah, 100%. So I'm gonna start by saying some of the things I'm going to unpack and talk about are not opinion. Most of these views are pretty much well rooted in sort of academic research and literature. The stuff that is opinion, I'll say is opinion, but most of this is kind of rooted in academic literature. So to start with, this idea that home prices seem high because of some relationship to price to income and price to rent, those are very back of the napkin, very rough measures of measuring how high or how irrational, say, home prices are. They're not necessarily the metrics most economists use to try to determine that. And partly because they're not perfect. I mean, as a simple example, I mean, if interest rates plummet, from 5% to 2%, and that allows me to borrow, 20% more or whatever the ratio is, it doesn't mean that growth is irrational. I mean, that growth is rooted in lower interest rates. So interest rates are one reason why those metrics are not perfect. So, I mean, when economists think about...
And can I interrupt? When you say that's not necessarily irrational, you mean that a consumer acting on that reality and spending 20% more on a house doesn't necessarily show irrational behavior.
Yeah, it doesn't show irrational behavior, and it doesn't show that they're even though prices may go up like, from 5 times income to 6 times income, that growth is not irrational, right? Because it could be rooted in lower interest rates. Now, obviously, that's not the entire story, because we have high interest rates today and prices are still high. But when economists look at whether home prices can be justified, there are kind of 3 approaches. One is, and it's not very common, it's looking at home prices relative to construction costs and replacement value. And that would be in markets where home price growth is relatively modest. And the theory is that home prices should not be increasing much more than the cost to actually build and replace those homes. That is not a very common approach. The 2 main approaches generally are one that looks at house prices relative to a number of macroeconomic variables, including income. So it would be things like, household income, unemployment rate, population growth, housing completions, all of these types of things, and measuring whether or not home prices make sense in that context. And in that sense, certainly, I mean, there are factors beyond just incomes that are driving home prices up. Canada's population's booming, our completions are not. There are a lot of other factors. The third approach, I'm not going to dwell on it too long, is when we look at price relative to rents. Again, economists do not just compare prices to rents because it doesn't take into account interest rates. They use something called like a user cost model that tries to look at what are the costs to maintaining and owning a home, minus some of the benefits, and that should roughly equal rents, right? So that is just kind of roughly how most economists look at it. It's tough to determine what is rational, I will say, okay? And it is not like most of the academic papers, if you read from 2005, like just before the peak of the US financial crisis, most of them argue that house prices or house price growth was rational and not irrational, kind of rooted in the fundamentals. So even determining what level is reasonable is very hard to determine, right? Now, there is a difference between markets that have high home prices and have high home prices over a sustained period of time versus a bubble, right? And I'll try to unpack them. I mean, there are a lot of markets around the world where home prices are very high and have been high for a long time and do not necessarily crash overnight back to 5 times household income. Some of the biggest cities in the world. And one of the reasons for that is because, there's one great paper called Superstar Cities that was written a while ago by 3 economists, 2 from Wharton, 1 from Columbia. And what they found was in some of these, if you imagine the superstar cities, they're the biggest cities you think of in the world, many that are magnets for people who wants to move there. And the other thing that kind of makes them sort of consistent is most of them are relatively supply constrained, right? So not only do people want to move there, but it's tough to build housing to sort of meet that demand. But in addition to sort of maybe demand exceeding supply, the other thing that makes them unique is that over time, what happens is wealthier and wealthier people kind of move there and can justify higher prices. And it's like when we think about the distribution of incomes, there are more people at the right on the more higher incomes who can justify these higher prices, which crowds out people who can't afford them, right? So this is how you have home prices that are 7, 8, 9, 10 times income in some cities. So now it's tough to determine to what extent that's sustainable. At least in Toronto right now, it's not really incomes that are driving home prices. I saw an economist tweet that the other day, and I'm like, how can you say incomes are driving home prices? Like in Canada, over the past 10 or 15 years, independent of the change in interest rates, you cannot borrow much more than 4.5 times your household income, maybe 5. And I say independent of interest rates because one of the reasons why OSFI and the bank regulator and CMHC put in the stress test, right? So the stress test is this test that basically says, we're going to look at how much you can qualify on a mortgage based on not just the interest that you're going to pay on the mortgage, but usually about 2% above that, right? So the reason the bank regulators did that is because they did not want lower interest rates or plummeting interest rates to allow this bidding up of home prices and fueling of debt, right? So even though rates have declined, say, especially during COVID in the previous years, our capacity to borrow has not changed very much. Because of the stress tests, right? We're being stress tested around 5% interest rate. So it's not really debt that's fueling that because over the past 10 plus years, every household can only borrow 4.5 to 5 times their income. What has been driving home prices, at least from my perspective, has been wealth from capital, from one generation giving to another, and this has sort of been fueling it. And not to say that this is good or justified. I'm not trying to rationalize, house prices that are 10 times income in Toronto. But it is, I guess my point is, it's not all irrational. There are a lot of cities where home prices are very high, and they stay there for a while because the wealth and the people who are buying them have shifted over time, right?
And just to clarify, maybe state the obvious, what you're saying is the homes are being bought for larger parts of them being bought in cash. And so the amount of income you would need to sustain a mortgage we may not see that average shift, but we're talking about people buying it outright and not needing those
or having
mortgages at
much
all.
bigger down payments, you
Right.
know, like first time buyers 15 years ago were getting gifts of like $30,000-$40,000 from their parents. You know what I mean? The ones who were getting gifts.
Mhm.
Today, those gifts are in the six figures. Like, you're not, 20 grand doesn't get you into a first home. You know what I mean? So as those down payment gifts have increased, you know, that is contributing to the driving up in prices. Now, going back to this concern of, is it a bubble? You know, like I said, high home prices are not necessarily a bubble. There are a ton of very expensive cities all around the world with high home prices. So high home prices does not necessarily mean they're going to crash tomorrow, right? Bubbles typically, and some people may disagree, but I mean, again, this is in the literature. Bubbles are not like long periods of high home prices. Usually there are short periods of this burst in home prices, right? So if you think about the historical trends in Toronto where home prices were going up 6% per year, that's not a bubble. You know, even periods where prices are going up 10% a year, that is a rapid rate of growth. It's not necessarily a bubble if it's sustained. You know, the periods where you have bubble-like growth are when prices are going up 30% per year, right? Or they're going up 20% in 4 months, which is what happened like from November of, I think, 2021 to like February of 2022. They went up a ridiculous amount in 4 months. This is bubble-like appreciation. And we probably saw two periods of this in the GTA. One was in 2017, where I wrote about it. It was like a lot, again, even back then, prices were booming. Everyone was arguing that this is just a supply problem. We need to build more homes, you know, and I argued and put a report saying, no, it's not just supply. This is like an investor fueled bubble. It is speculative usually. And that's what makes bubbles bubbles. It's like usually fueled by investors, usually fueled by speculation. And in 2017, it was a suburban low-rise bubble. It was not downtown homes. It wasn't condos. It was like low-rise homes in the suburbs. And that market fell. And then, of course, you know, we had this bubble fueled by low rates over COVID, which peaked in 2022 in February, and then prices declined and have since recovered a little bit. So, I mean, all that to say, you know, kind of going back to the original question, it's hard to predict where home prices are going to be tomorrow. There are a lot of forces contributing to the high level, you know, not just capital to home buyers, you know, banks doing whatever they can to ensure homeowners don't default. Like there are a lot of these, you know, variables that are contributing to the level we're at right now. So I'm not convinced that we're going to go back to this period where home prices crash 40%, you know, and home prices are 6 times household income. I think like we would have a massive economic problem if that happened. And again, it's not to rationalize it, but again, I think Toronto is getting to the point where it's a city that will be expensive, you know, and I don't know what that means. Maybe it plateaus for a little bit, but I don't believe necessarily that we're going to have this massive crash. I mean, to have that, you'd have to have a very, very deep recession and a lot of unemployment, which again, doesn't look like it's the path we're going on. So I don't know if I help provide some clarity, but you can tell me if anything didn't make sense.
You know, I think that does make sense. And as to Manu's question, you know, the overall question of is Toronto in a bubble-like territory is a perennial one. And I think you've laid out well what you'd be looking for. Now, the only thing I'm a little bit confused about still is when can we tell apart these times where, okay, there's a sustained amount versus this rapid acceleration? Like, how do we try to anticipate whether we're in a rapid acceleration? So you said that from 2021 to 2022, we saw a rapid fall in prices. That was the post-COVID boom that saw a huge run up in prices. That started to come down around when interest rates started to get hiked up. I think it was March, right? 2022 that the first rates started going up. Now we're in a prolonged rate hiking cycle that saw prices come down a bit and then rapidly, and now they sort of since then have been staying even. So would you say that we're in one of these areas where things are constant and so not a bubble territory? And then how do you then see that we're in a bubble territory? It's like one of these things you only seem to be able to see in hindsight. And if you're a buyer, what can you do to avoid being in that hindsight, being in that guy that or girl that bought at the peak?
It's such a hard question. It's a very good one. Can I just to clarify a couple of things you said? I think so. Prices, yes, peaked in February 2022. They fell about 20%. Were flat until December of 2022, but have since increased. The trend in Toronto in 2023 is actually prices have been rising, especially for low-rise homes, which again is shocking. It's surprising that we would be in an environment where prices are going up. That's largely because there's just no inventory, but we talk about that on our monthly update. So going back to your question about when should you be cautious? I mean, the simplest way to think about it is, when growth is relatively constant, single digits, maybe low double digits, that is high, but is usually not fueled by exuberance, right? Again, exuberance a lot of times is homes getting 50 offers, 30 offers, and prices appreciating by 20+% per year, right? And you usually can see the momentum building. Now, it's hard to say when you hit pause, right? Because it's easy after the fact to say, well, it was obvious the end of 2021, beginning of 2022 was bubble-like, right? And you shouldn't have bought. But the reality is we had a very similar market at the end of 2020 and the beginning of 2021. For some reason, it was like these periods from like November to like February, March of both of those were crazy, right? So, again, the November, December 2020 was almost like 9 months after the start of the lockdowns. And we had this boom in prices. And back then it was like 20, 30 offers on homes and a rapid acceleration in prices, and even back then I was like, this feels like a bubble. But what happened? Literally from the spring of 2021 until the end of 2021, prices were largely flat. It's like we had this burst. It's like someone lit a spark, it exploded, but then it kind of plateaued, right? And this is where I think the one thing that a lot of policymakers that I speak with got caught off guard, because in 2021, the market was calm until the very end of the year. And at the end of the year, I can't remember what it was, maybe November 2021, it's like people went crazy again. And within the span of 4 months, prices went up. I mean, off the top of my head, I don't know, like 300 grand on average for low-rise homes, like something insane in the span of like 4 months. So again, I mean, you don't know, these are hard things to predict in the moment, but again, I think, there's that classic saying that, you should be fearful when others are greedy and greedy when others are fearful, right? So, the idea with that is that during periods when people are looking at buying real estate because they're going to make tons of money and they're just bidding on tons of homes and there's 50 offers, is in theory the time that you should be a little bit more cautious, right? But again, it's hard as a buyer because you need a home. You're worried if you're cautious and you wait, it's going to be 10% more 6 months from now. So I feel there's no perfect answer. You know what I mean? So, but in theory, yeah, those are the periods where you should be a little bit more cautious.
And it seems like there's two different things there. Like after the COVID lockdown started to end, that bounce back, the COVID bounce was not a bounce. It was a spike. It was insane. It was Canadians saying, oh, the world isn't going to end. Okay, we're just going to go back to overbidding on real estate like we always do. Exactly. And that was in covering the news for Move Smartly. I remember one of the strangest reactions. It was like we were worried for a second, the market froze. And then the reaction when we realized, okay, things might stabilize was, you might argue, an overreaction. Yeah. So that runs up and then the prices really go up. What is the difference between a period like now where prices are going up, But the reason is because of limited inventory. And I agree. I invite viewers and listeners to listen to our monthly market update. But one of the main reasons you talk about is low inventory. Houses are not hitting the market for sale in as great as numbers as we've seen on average in previous years. Now, I think we've all talked about, maybe it's because sellers are getting stuck. If they do sell, where can they afford to buy at these high interest rates, right? So would you call that a more structural factor that's rational, that's keeping people from moving, rather than just what you might call exuberance or bubble-like? Like, is that how we might think about it, or am I misunderstanding these terms?
No, that's a good assessment, actually, that, even though the growth this year has been pretty quick, like prices have gone up pretty rapidly in a short period of time. You're right. It would be very hard, even though I've said that there's this feeling in the market, like this fear of missing out in the spring. Buyers were getting anxious. So, those are kind of bubble-like symptoms, but generally, yes. I don't think it was like exuberance that was driving it. It was really driven by a lack of inventory. And there's just nothing to choose from. And like when you have a lot of people who need a family home and there's nothing to buy, it's going to bid up prices, right? So, but one important thing to think about is that it doesn't have to be a bubble or whatever you want to call it to see price declines. Like, the market is always vulnerable. If rates stay this high for 2 years, who on earth knows what the market is going to look like? Because the reality is a lot of households, some investors are not going to be able to manage with renewing their mortgage at 5 or 5.5%, right? If we see a recession and job losses, who knows what's going to happen? So it's not about bubbles bursting. It is going to be like a shift in economic conditions that leads to potentially pressure and distress and all of these things, which is kind of what triggered the financial crisis. It was like these resetting of mortgages that people couldn't afford, and the whole house of cards collapsed, right?
Right. And that was, you're talking about the 2008?
Yeah, the 2000, yeah, exactly.
In the US?
In the US, where a lot of people had these adjustable rate mortgages. Think of them like variable rate mortgages, where you have these, they start low and they have this big increase after, and people just couldn't afford them. They got lured in by these teaser rates, and the whole thing just collapsed. So
before we move on, I'm wondering if, because I kind of have this thinking maybe like Manu, what if we're in a situation like that right now, where because of these sellers who have been hanging on, because the banks and the government have been willing to let them extend their amortizations, do everything to keep Canadians in their homes, what if we do start to see an uptick in people not able to renew, not able to hold on to their properties, having to add their properties onto the market for sale, and you bought in this period? And so let's say 6 months from now, there's way more properties on the market and the prices attenuate a bit. How much should you worry as an individual buyer? Like, how can you deal with that? And and how should you think about that? It's possible you might buy for a bit higher now than you might see in 6 months.
It's a great question. And honestly, like, I don't have the answer, because we cannot predict where things are going. Okay. The wisdom of the markets in the fall of 2022, if you asked a lot of, people about what's going on in the market, everyone was very pessimistic about 2023. Okay. Most people were thinking, oh my God, 2022, why are you buying? If you're on Twitter, for example, where I am, every like vocal housing commentator behind an anonymous Twitter account was basically saying anyone who's buying in 2022 is a complete idiot, because the market is obviously going to crash in 2023, right? It was obvious because we have higher rates. It takes a while for rates to jump. I don't think anyone predicted prices would be higher in 2023, right? I certainly didn't. To me, it wasn't obvious that they're going to crash or that they're going to go up. I had no idea where they're going to go. So again, like, you can't make your home buying decisions based on your forecast of what's going to happen in the market in the next 6 months. It is 100, and most of our clients who bought in 2022, for example, in the second half, most of them bought expecting or knowing that it is very possible that prices might decline, say 10 or 15%. I don't think any one of our clients who bought thought that prices were going to skyrocket in 2023, right? So, and I think this is the right mindset. It's basically saying, I need a home. I can't time it properly. Whatever happens, if I buy now and prices are down 10% a year later, it is what it is. I'm buying for the long term, you know, and their idea is if you're buying to hold on to and live in that home for 10 years, you're more worried about what it looks like 10 years from now rather than in the short term, because we can't predict these many ups and downs. And there's so many factors that are contribute to where the housing market goes over the next 9 to 12 months, basically. And we don't know. They're all macroeconomic. What's going on inflation? What's going on with rates? What's going on in the economy? What's going on in Russia? Like all of these things impact where rates are, where the economy is going, where the market's going, and you just can't predict them.
All right. So as a consumer, what I'm hearing you say is, if my buying move is predicated on an assumption that prices will be up in a year or 2 years or 3 years or 4 years, that might be something I want to relook at. You know, you want to make sure that if you're buying, you can afford it, you can deal with the mortgage payments over the next couple of years. So if there's something like, and prices will really appreciate and I'll just sell, then you might be in a dangerous territory, because that's something you can't always time. And I'm hearing from you that that's why you hear experts, yourself included, others, financial planners often say, hold for 10 years. And that is one of the reasons why it allows the dips and the rises to kind of average out in terms of your holdings. Okay. Hopefully Manu found that helpful. I know I did. I had many of the same questions. Let's go on to our question number 2. Hi, John, longtime viewer, first time asking a question. Thanks to you and the Move Smartly team for your show. Well, thank you. For once, I can also say thank you. Thank you. We love your questions. I am currently renting a condo in the Toronto core after having been bought out of my marital home, which was a semi-detached, minus our mortgage owing. So I think after that, I roughly have $300,000 to put into a new property. While I really do enjoy condo living, I'm not sure whether I would enjoy being a condo owner, because historically, condos have not appreciated at the same rate as houses, at least in the Toronto area. If I was to consider partnering with some family members in buying a house, whether an existing triplex or something we could convert to a multiplex and run it as a shared business, would this be a good idea? And if I wanted to keep living in my condo rather than living in one of those units, would this be a reasonable way to invest in Toronto's housing market while not being limited in terms of where I actually have to live? My first question is whether my assumptions re condo and house appreciation are on the right track, and whether I'm missing something in my thinking. My second question is, in your own experience, if I do buy a multiplex and run it as a rental business with family members, what issues and challenges should we be aware of? Thank you, Maya.
That's a good question. And there's a lot to think about and comment on. Okay, so let's go with the original question about her idea that she's reluctant to be a condo buyer because condos have not appreciated as much. I personally never recommend making decisions based on that, because yes, technically condos have not appreciated as much as homes, but even among homes, some neighborhoods will appreciate faster than others. So trying to make your home buying decisions based on our assumptions of which property type or which neighborhood will be the best investment is not the way I would make decisions, because these things are not really predictable. I think it's more important to focus on, this idea that, do you want to be a homeowner? Because this first situation of, buying a condo to live in and to basically use it as an owner-occupied house is completely different from being an investor. Right? They're just two completely different decisions. In the one situation, she's buying, she owns the unit, she doesn't have to worry about tenants, she's not a landlord, she just owns her home and she's going to be there 10 plus years. I would not say no to that, just out of the bat, because of this idea that it may not appreciate as much. So that is the first assumption I would challenge. With respect to the other situation of buying a condo as a triplex or a duplex as an investment property, that is a completely different situation. Obviously, at that point, you're basically becoming a landlord, and do you want to own a multiplex rental property with family members? And I think there are a lot of considerations, certainly when you're doing that. So, I mean, for starters, you're looking at, the most traditional metrics, the cash flow, the mortgage. You want to make sure that the property can kind of somewhat carry itself, but it starts becoming a little bit trickier when you have properties that some of the owners might live in, right? Because in a normal rental property, you have 3 units, you rent the market rent, that is your revenue, you pay your expenses, and whatever's left with your shareholders, effectively, your partners or your shareholders, you split whatever additional costs are needed, or whatever cash is left at the end, you split amongst you and your partners or your family members. But when each person is living in the units, it's completely different, because then, you need to find a property that has units that each person actually wants to live in for the next 5+ years, right? So if your family member wants to live in one of the units, is there one that they want to live in? Then they're paying, of course, in theory, on paper, you'd probably want to treat it as a business. That's what I would do. If I bought a property with my brother and my brother wanted to live in the unit, doesn't matter what's the market rent, that is technically what they are paying for it, because it goes into one general account, so you can operate the expenses for the building. I mean, they're kind of treated like a tenant effectively, right? In terms of cash flow purposes and managing the finances. So, you definitely want to get legal advice as well to figure out how to structure it, and advice, obviously, from accountants as well to figure out what the best structure is. Do you want to do it, if you're buying it with 1 or 2 other people, are you buying in 3 personal names? Are you setting up a small corporation? So there are a lot of considerations when you're looking at buying an investment property strictly as an investment.
All right. Yeah, that's good considerations. And what happens if that one brother ends up doing a little bit more work around the house?
Well,
Does that become, part of the discussion as well? So.
Well, yeah, potentially. Like if you are, if I bought a property with one of my siblings and they're living there and they're effectively acting like a property manager, then yes, you would effectively pay them like a property manager. Like I that's the way I like to do things. Like you want to do things as a business. Like you don't want to make the one person who's doing more work feel like they're doing it out of some sort of charity, or they have to. Like if they weren't doing it and I had to hire someone, what would I have to pay that person to do? Right. And I think that's the best way to deal with those situations, even when it is family members, unless you're dividing, the work or the labor in some other way, like one person does the accounting and the management, the other one does, you know what I mean? In that case, yeah, no one gets compensated because we're dividing sort of the responsibilities equally. But if one person's doing most of the work, then yeah, 100% they should be compensated for it.
Some really good ideas. Now, the last part of Maya's question, I tend to have the same question, but thinking about it another way. If you are a renter, there seems to be this idea of, are there other ways that I can invest my money to at least be part of the Toronto housing appreciation story? Because it seems to be the engine that doesn't quit. As much as we worry about bubbles, a lot of us worry about being left out of that appreciation story if we're renters. So it seems like Maya Solutions, one way to try and gain on appreciation while still being a renter. What do you think about that thinking? And are there other ways to think about it?
No, I think it's a great approach. I have clients once who were renting for like 6 years and they own like, I don't know, 2 or 3 triplexes. It's like they didn't own their own home. They just kept investing in rental properties. So I don't think that's a bad approach. It allows her to invest in real estate if that's how she wants to invest some of her money. You just have to be prepared to, being a landlord, especially a small landlord. There are, understand the Residential Tenancies Act, understand your rights and your obligations as a landlord. But certainly I think it is a decent approach if you want to be invested in the market. She wants to have a little bit of a, she doesn't want to put her money in a condominium, and she wants to have, to own a share, like a 50% of a larger triplex. That's not a bad approach. And I know people who do that effectively. So I think and some people who obviously own their homes. And like I said, I've had clients who just rented and just invested in triplexes. So I definitely think that's an approach that she can take.
All right. Well, thank you. And now let's get on to question 3. Dear John, here is my question. I have an investment property with a HELOC of $850,000 available for use. I also have $700,000 in cash and $300,000 in some other investments. I have been renting for a year now, and I'm thinking of buying either a townhouse or a condo for about $800,000 to $1 million. I am thinking to put about 50 to 60% down. My question is, should I use my HELOC to pay for the property or my cash to buy it? Thanks, Martina.
Martina has a problem that a lot of people wish they had, I think.
Yeah, I was going to say some of those numbers. Yes.
Amazing.
Yes.
So that's a very good challenge and situation to be in. So just to clarify, she has an investment property. So she has a HELOC available. So for the, if viewers aren't familiar with that, it's basically like a mortgaged line of credit that she can draw on for $800,000.
And usually at a lower interest rate because it's secured against
well,
property.
Well, lower interest rate than an unsecured. Yes.
Right.
Today, the HELOC is more expensive than an actual mortgage. Like if she locked it into a longer term mortgage, it would be lower because variable rates are a lot higher today.
Yes, we need to think about that. Usually the HELOC story has been the cheaper way to borrow money, but right now we're in a situation where it's the more expensive way to borrow money.
Exactly. So the question is, should she borrow against the HELOC or use her cash? And she's looking at buying between $800,000 to $1 million, and she's planning on putting 50% down. So $400,000, $400,000 to $500,000, and she would have a $400,000 to $500,000 mortgage on the condo she's buying. So what would I do? That's a very difficult question. I mean, I don't know all of the financial details, but here's a couple things. I mean, generally, the normal argument when you have an investment property is, make sure that it is sort of cash flow neutral, that you're not, bleeding a lot of cash out of it. So, you have to take money out of your pocket. So usually most people would say, make sure that one's cash flow neutral. And depending on that, you kind of borrow as needed or use cash if you need to. Now, I'm not an accountant and I hate giving tax advice. I think I gave a comment last week that wasn't 100% correct and I qualified it. So take this with a grain of salt. But generally speaking, what you would want to do in this situation, if I was in her situation, is actually maximize the debt on the investment property because it's tax deductible, right? It is a rental property. So for example, you would not like just keeping that HELOC there and taking cash out and putting it down as a down payment is not you'd rather take a $400,000 mortgage off of your investment property, have more debt on that one and less debt on your principal residence, right? Because that one, you can deduct the interest on it and all the other expenses. So generally speaking, I mean, I think the most important consideration if you're in this situation is to figure out what is the out-of-pocket sort of amount that you're willing to spend both on your principal residence and to manage your investment property, right? So for example, if we go with the assumption that the investment property has to be cash flow neutral, and she's talking about having a mortgage of up to $500,000 on her principal residence, that means she can manage $3,000 a month out of her own pocket, right? So the question is more, how much money can you afford out of your own pocket to manage both of these properties? And then what you generally want to do is allocate generally most of the debts to be on the investment one so you can deduct that interest. That's generally what I would do. And if I was in her situation, I mean, not to get in the weeds, but if she did want to take out a small mortgage on the home she's buying, right, then the principal residence, what I'd probably also do is she probably got a mortgage on the investment property, right? And if she took that mortgage out more than 2 years ago or the past year and a half, it's probably got a very low interest rate. So what you would want to do is basically transfer that mortgage, if you can, to your principal residence so that your home has the low interest rate, and then get a new mortgage at today's rates on the investment property, right? Because I'd rather pay 5% interest on the investment property where I can kind of deduct those expenses versus having a low interest rate on the investment one and having to pay 5% on my principal residence, right? So you're basically just trying to, and again, I think these are considerations that she'd want to go through with an accountant, basically, obviously looking at her personal finances and a financial advisor potentially, but just principally sort of this is the approach that I would take, just to take advantage of some of the tax benefits of having an investment property and being able to deduct some of those expenses.
Sounds good. You're always very careful to say all of these decisions you should be making with a professional, but what you said is helpful, because a lot of times when you meet with your accountant and your financial planner, you have to go in there with some ideas about what it is that you might want to do, right? I mean, and get the advice, the final word on that. So it is good to sort of think about these things at a high level.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny you say that, because I learned that years ago. I mean, I started, managing my family's properties when I was quite young, in my 20s. And I'll never forget, like, we'd be doing things, we'd want to make some investment or whatever. And, a lot of times, because my mom was in good health, my father was not, and my father used to run everything. I mean, my mom would come up with these cooked up ideas and be like, this is what I think we should do. We should do it through this company and borrow against that one, and do, like, she had all these ideas in my head. I'm like, how did you think of that? And, you run it by the accountants. The accountant's like, yeah, it's a good idea, and like, I mean, they didn't come up with it. And her whole thing was, and she would often say this, and she was right, that it's exactly like you said, they don't, like, the accountants they don't understand necessarily your goals or your business, right? So it is always helpful to, unless they're like specifically specialized in real estate, they're not going to be necessarily thinking about how to structure things for you based on your business. And it is helpful a lot of times to go in with specific ideas to get their feedback on them, right? So I do think it's important to kind of get ideas from other people who own rental properties and investment properties, because your accountant might not. And that was her argument. She's right. Our accountant did not own rental properties. He thought some of the things we're doing didn't make sense, right? But technically we're fine, but like, he couldn't justify them because he couldn't justify the investments and so on and so forth. He was looking at it from another lens. So it is important to get different opinions and to bounce those off of your lawyer and your accountants.
Yeah. So always get the proper last, the final advice. We do take corrections very seriously. John mentioned he did have to make a correction to one of his comments last week. You can always find those corrections at the bottom of our videos on YouTube. And, and sometimes we'll also issue them on our social media channels. So you get a lot of things right. Nobody can get everything right. So we always emphasize the need to check and then check again.
Yeah.
But again,
and I'll just clarify, I think the correction was, and I was thinking about what someone asked about making deductions as a renter or as a homeowner. You cannot deduct, for example, your I think it was like the interest on your mortgage for your home office. I think that was the one correction I had to make. I mean, I usually don't do that because I don't have one, but I'm used to deducting it if you had a rental suite, which you can because it is a rental property, but you can't do that. So yeah, I have that in one of the previous videos.
So again, you may have that idea as our previous, I think it was in response to someone who thought, well, I can write off my office. Exactly. So again, that's the kind of idea you would come in with, to your professional, to your accountant, to your financial planner, to your lawyer, and just make sure that the ideas that you have are in fact the right ones. So I think that's it for our questions today. Again, I invite everybody to send in their questions. Ask John at movesmartly.com. You can reach us on our social channels as well. Move Smartly we're the Move Smartly channel here on YouTube. On Twitter, we're at Move Smartly. And John, why don't you share your Twitter handle? Your very popular Twitter handle.
It's at John Pasalis. And of course, anyone who has more specific questions, they can always set up a consult. Just go to movesmartly.com/meetjohn. And then we can meet to talk about those questions in more detail as well.
All right. So once again, thank you to everyone for your fantastic questions. Keep them coming. Thank you, John, for your very well-considered answers. And we'll see you guys in a month.